I'm supposed to hit this light that's blinking at me. No, it was done for me? Amazing. Magical powers. Thank you, Omar. That was so beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Omar and Leslie, for inviting me to join the seminar. Thank you all for coming out on a chilly evening when there are lots of other things to do in New York, including go home and get warm. And I'm very, very happy to share this work with friends old and new. Really happy. So some preliminary remarks. I've been working on this project, the project called Seeing the Problem, for a really long time. And it takes me a long time to do anything, to write anything, to figure out where I'm going. And I appreciate that you've all come out because I'm hopeful that you'll help me with the figuring out in this paper. I'm going to read some and I'm going to talk some, and sometimes you won't know which I'm doing, I hope. And I have some images that I will share with you because after all, calling something seeing the problem demands some visuals. And I look forward to seeing what you think. So thank you, Omar. Thank you, Leslie. Thank you to the staff, the students, and faculty of the program. Thank you to the people who will clean up this room. When we go, please take your garbage with you. All right. What if photographs depict what should not have been? Jacqueline Goldsby, Spectacular Secret. I have been inconsistent in my relationship with and treatment of moving and still photographic images that depict what should not have been. First, I'll briefly describe two projects in which visual documentation of premature violent death played a central role in organizing evidence for political persuasion. Then, after showing or gesturing toward the fragility of those projects' underlying assumptions, I'll explore some social features and uses that shaped and shadowed the democratization of photographic image making, looping backward and forward through time in order to emphasize certain high points in an archipelago of meaning. And finally, I will offer the outlines of a counter-narrative, and actually a story that fills my heart, to highlight how we might usefully consider the co-constitutive interdependencies of consciousness, historical geography, and the machine in the process of materializing objects that inspire subjects in struggle. So the first piece is the Rodney King beating, which all of you should know about, right? Everybody? Some of you are too young to have experienced it, but you're old enough to know about it. I could not look at George Holliday's Home movie after the first time I saw it in 1991. But I wrote about it, dissecting it, I thought, in terms of its context and its interpretation in the first trial that ended with the acquittal of the 4 police officers who did the beating. The police officers' defense attorneys used the videotape to change the tape's apparent narrative. And through stop action and freeze frame, they managed to convince an already biased jury that Mr. King's movements, trying to get up, trying to get away, caused and justified the savagery. Today, in testimony against gun control, one often comes across references to the 1992 LA uprising that was set off by the cops' acquittal, with opposition between the blacks and property owners figured as the central antagonistic contradiction that guns alone can resolve. Second, maximum security university. Also in the early 1990s, in order to protect himself or perhaps to blackmail his colleagues, a prison guard stole a date and timestamp security camera tape cassette that shows, in low resolution black and white, the murder of imprisoned men in the California State System Security Housing Unit at Corcoran. To campaign against these serially excused killings, an organization with which I worked, California Prison Focus, created a documentary in which the explanatory counter-narrative to the official story unfolds using stop action and freeze frame, while a voiceover painstakingly demonstrates the exonerations were based on easily falsifiable claims of time and danger. Well, needless to say, nothing came of that effort. These uses and experiences have made me ask, so what did you see anyway? This project, Seeing the Problem, resulted from a whole lot of emails, phone calls, and Skype conversations that I had with some colleagues, oh my God, almost 9 years ago. We started talking about this. And then when the Arab Spring, let the record reflect that I put air quotes around Arab Spring, when the uprisings in North Africa and West Asia took off, and many, many people outside of that region and in the region thought that the rapid circulation of digital moving imagery caused what happened, we thought we had to do something. So Cedric Robinson, who's now passed away, Françoise Vergès, Avery Gordon, and I started a project that we unrolled in Beirut, and I've continued to work on it from 2013 until now. What we want to do, what we wanted to do in our project and what interests me now is not to prove one way or the other whether or not the circulation of images did or did not incite people to rise up in North Africa and West Asia. That doesn't interest me. What interests me is the larger task, which is undoing the scourge of racial capitalism, which is to say all of capitalism, and the scourge of racism, therefore, which is to say group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It is a project, in other words, about decolonial struggle on a world scale, fought out territory by territory, scale by scale, and place by place. So if anybody can see the wrong, it's there in the recording. And then we're stuck with the apparent fact that what matters more is not so much representation as representability, which involves not only engaging but also changing consciousness. So that is maybe the heart of the discussion for this evening. At least part of the problem today, in 2019, lies in the view that the proliferation into ordinary and extraordinary people's hands of the means of making picture and sound recordings should shift the balance of forces. But this assumption is based in a concept we social scientists have mostly abandoned. Here I'm being a social scientist, professional geographer. We've abandoned the notion that somehow data can speak for themselves. These meditations, my meditations tonight, compelled me to keep looking backward, not so much in the hope that a particular historical moment will explain the present, but rather in the nervous need to recalibrate our results across consciousness, historical geography, and the machine in order to challenge how we go about becoming, which is to say making and living our perpetual experiments in freedom struggle. Although I was not at first concerned with film, but rather with analog and digital video, my reflective excursion on vivid display led inevitably to Kodak, the multinational firm, longtime major employer and patron of Rochester, New York, and the innovator that above all others democratized photography in the late 19th century. Rochester, Underground Railroad terminus, home to Frederick Douglass. After the Second World War ended, many black people from Georgia moved to Rochester, displaced from home by changing land use, some by agricultural mechanization, and many others by the enormous population transfers and industrial and residential reconfigurations brought about by the then rising military-industrial complex. While the number of black people in Rochester quadrupled in this period, employment opportunities at the city's major employer were limited, setting off a long struggle for fair employment that never, ever resolved in favor of those in need of jobs. At the same time that Kodak struggled to maintain its profile as a laudably paternalistic firm, paying generous employee benefits, as well as establishing schools, scholarships, and underwriting arts and education more broadly, it faced a challenge to its color film. Lorna Roth has written a series of articles on this matter, and I'm indebted to her diligent archival and interview research. While the job struggle elicited defensive or dismissive public statements, such as racist jokes about the presumed agricultural experience of black workers, the color issue turned out differently. Every dark-skinned person can attest to the fact that color photographs often didn't bring the joy they might for light-skinned persons. And here I didn't say black, because I don't mean black. Be mindful of the performance effect and listen to what I say rather than what you think you see. And it was nearly impossible when a mix of skin tones gathered for a single shot. Kodak didn't invent color film, but as with most of its products until late in the game, it innovated early and successfully to dominate markets on price and quality. Kodachrome film, its color stock, was the popular, in many cases, professional standard from 1935 onward. Kodak changed the film, but not because of people. Rather, it was, I can't see, chocolate. Chocolate manufacturers had perfected a range of preparations that allowed the candy to appear in a variety of shapes and hues. Firms wanted to show this in glossy magazine photographs where advertising costs had dropped substantially with the development of new printing processes. So the chocolatier, supported by racehorse owners and other bosses and purveyors of the dark and shiny, like furniture manufacturers, compelled the change. And as an aside, in my reading excursion, I found my way to another company town, Hershey, Pennsylvania, where Milton Hershey, manufacturer of chocolate candy and also a great local benefactor, turns out not only to have been sheltering boys in his orphanage, but also stealing their labor in his factories, at the same time that he conspicuously gifted scholarships to the free world boys, also working class kids, whose household structures enabled them to have homes and to go to college. End of aside. Chocolate and unfreedom have a long history. While investigating the sordid history of this delicious food, I stumbled on an astonishing artifact. I have to pull this out there. And this is just an artifact, so don't worry that you can't read it. Just appreciate its artifactualness. The March 13th, 1897 issue of the Scientific American featured both an article on color photography and one on ending slavery in Africa. The report on photography considered it might be a hoax, but the narrator accepted the evidence presented to his eyes. He saw the picture through all steps of the process and could not imagine when a stealthy fraudster might have hand-colored the image. Seeing is believing until or unless falsified. Bridging the reports on color photographs and ending slavery in Africa, a short enthusiastic article on the possibility of thought transference encouraged the scientifically inclined to consider the illogic of contemporary understandings of human capacity, time, space, and change. So ending slavery in Africa was, of course, the Berlin Conference's cover story a decade and a half before Scientific American published its article. At the behest of Portugal, former, current, and would-be imperial powers carved up the continent and then legalized the license to settle and steal by way of treaty, ratified even by the United States, that took effect in April of 1892, which is to say 58 years before I was born. Now, I want to point out to you, can you hear me? Okay, there's the map of the continent. They also have over here a globe. They were seeing the solution. The Scientific American source on African slavery, another page from the artifact. The Scientific American source on African slavery was Élie Chatelain, a Swiss-born business agent and missionary who brought the New Testament to the region, wrote grammars of local languages, and took copious pictures in the stereographic mode to prove his claims. So if you want to kind of imagine Élie Chatelain from fiction, think of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, and either Marlowe or Kurtz, either one can play the role. In addition, the eponymous Quaker family that owned the English Cadbury chocolate makers also investigated slavery, especially in São Tomé, which at the time had nearly every arable inch planted in cocoa trees. West Africa produces about 70% of cacao today. The details of its origin are disputed, but apparently it emerged from a climate specific to the Amazonian rainforest and traveled northward to Mesoamerica with pre-Columbian merchants or imperial forces, or both, where, by the time Europeans came along, it had become the God's drink. Growers established plantations in Trinidad and Tobago and elsewhere in the Caribbean, and then moved commercial production steadily eastward to West Africa, and then across to East Africa and to South and Southeast Asia. Cacao flourishes only in a relatively narrow band straddling the equator, and the trees require shade along with heat. Like cotton was and sugarcane to an extent remains, it is labor intensive. Control of plantations consolidated throughout the 19th century, but due to forces that I won't discuss in this talk, the tendency toward industrialization reversed. It reversed. And today, most cacao, like most food, is grown by small producers. Who, however, sell only to a few processors, who then sell to manufacturers, whose #1 country of location is Belgium. So some of you might shop at Brooklyn Fair or other yuppie food shops, as do I, and you might have found, wait, oh no, spoiling my story. There it is. You might have come across, candy bars like this. So this is all fair trade, and you see the people who grew the cacao, and the manufacturers guarantee that they know what happened from the pod that the cocoa came out of through its manufacturing, and this family is happy and full-cheeked as a result of fair trade. And that may be true. That may be true. The causes of slavery in Africa, back to our artifact, the pictures of this is now back in 1897, were not, say, King Leopold's Belgium or Rhodes's Cape to Cairo railway plan or Portugal's desperate effort to cut and control a west-east swath from Angola to Mozambique. Rather, Chatelain concluded slavery's causes were Islam, paganism, witchcraft, and immoral white men. The remedy? This is where the science comes in. Establish Christian missionary industrial agricultural towns, lock out all the forces conducive to unfreedom by presumably locking in the resident workers who then become disciplined to the wage. The scientific vision of social order drew inspiration from Alabama's Tuskegee Institute, whose founder, Booker T. Washington, himself born a slave in the United States and a more complex figure than this incident suggests, headed up the philanthropic wing of the legal struggle against slavery in Africa. Then sounds so much like now. At the same time that Scientific American took up the causes of color photography and anti-slavery, the United States was in full prelude to the American century, achieving by technology transfer, ideological expansion, and imperial colonial conquest across the Pacific and down into the Caribbean, its modernizing empire that would fold creditor status into its other power-producing capacities in the First World War. Coinciding here are three major shifts: horizontal consolidation and vertical integration of capitalist firms, the establishment of large-scale, complex governmental institutions developed to guarantee the extraction of value from labor and land, think social engineering, public schools, infrastructural development, the mail, progressivism, and three, the apartheid eugenics dyad to sort and stack humans. The science of Scientific American was then a science of society as a whole, whose integument was and continues to be organized and ad hoc violence of racial capitalism. In this context, the Kodak firm grew and developed affordable, not to everyone but to enough, cameras, film, and printers. By 1888, the Rochester Optical Company's postcard printer could turn out 1 to 1,000 postcards almost anywhere. 1888. Just want to emphasize that. Amateurs could use it effectively though of course having the machine could make an amateur into a professional of some sort. The machine could be taken to a school, to a wedding, to a lynching. Jim Crow laws codified US apartheid and enforced it by way of both organized and ad hoc, though not random or even particularly spontaneous violence. Everyone whose work I've read on US lynching writes something about Henry Smith, who was lynched in Paris, Texas in 1893. The re-representation of his murder and the crowd that gathered to avenge the child he was accused of killing took the form of both still and eventually moving pictures. Some of the still pictures depict, and I'm not going to show you any pictures of lynching, so don't hold your breath, either way, of anxiety or hope. Some of the still pictures depicting him on a platform surrounded by thousands of people before becoming postcards were hand-colored in workshops. I haven't learned yet what that was like, to sit in a workshop applying specified color to specified portions of a card, one after another, along an assembly line. The sculptor, professor, and postcard enthusiast, T. Howard Woody, found clues to this, and I hope someday to find my way to his papers and see what he learned. Goldsby, Jackie Goldsby, whose remark was the epigram for this paper, pursued her curiosity about photographers of lynching, especially black picture-taking men, and speculated poignantly about the people who sent postcards with handwritten comments to friends and relatives. I wonder about the people who participated in coloring the postcards, as secondhand witness or not, yet also as primary producers of the consciousness-shaping horror that the postcards then would ensure. The archive of Henry Smith's torture murder was thick. Not only was the event, which lasted a long time, photographed in minute detail, it was also sound recorded, 1893. By a year after Smith's death, one could see a display of pictures and listen to his screams and groans on a street corner in Seattle. The year of his death, 1893, was the year of the Columbian Exposition. The late Cedric Robinson, whose thinking shaped how I've come to think this paper and pretty much everything about the world, argues that film appealed as a way to see the unthinkably different rather than to make endlessly repeatable a confection from the stage, say, a play. Or perhaps, it has occurred to me, it might be that film came about to enhance the ability to see the ascriptively sane, which then is for somebody, those who are seen, the unthinkably differentiated. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, one could pay a nickel to watch Henry Smith's torture murder as a film. The pictures linked and set in motion on a roll, another Kodak innovation, with the sound playing in sync. Hear his groans read a sidewalk advert board in New York City. I mentioned that Élie Chatelain showed many stereoscopic pictures with his talks to various geographic societies to illustrate the truth of African slavery. Some women in one picture kneel, coupled by chains, and look behind the camera. And this, of course, is always the stock picture of slavery. Whether people are for slavery or against slavery, it's always a picture of people in chains. Meanwhile, elsewhere, in North America, some men, lynched but not yet tortured and burned, stand with chains around their necks and look directly at the lens. Like rape, lynching unleashes a force to shape the social by way of the violent expression of a right to rule, a force at once homogenized in the ability to harm with impunity, but even in that ritual, a force differentiated by role in the action, number of bullets or lashes allocated, proximity to the killing, souvenir granted, smirk allowed. So I've argued elsewhere, I'm gonna skip that. Never mind what I argued elsewhere. Everyone who writes about lynching periodizes it from lynching in the United States, periodizes 1890 to 1940 as key. Though before 1890, of course, group intimidation and unofficial violence prompted the Radical Reconstruction U.S. Congress to pass the 1871 Ku Klux Klan Act, a law invoked in Palestinian-American Stephen Salaita's case to challenge the University of Illinois administrators and trustees' collusion in his wrongful dismissal. No, it was not an anti-lynching law, but it had the breadth to encompass lynching in its purview. So I did not say, and I do not say, that Stephen was lynched. He was, however, horribly wronged. Henry Smith died only once, alone, tortured, in horrible and prolonged agony and unthinkable fear, while thousands watched, smelling his burning flesh, hearing him scream and scream and scream and scream and scream and scream and scream. But then he seemed to die again and again and again. For decades, he kept dying, as Laquan McDonald and Walter Scott and so many others have and will. 1890 to 1940, the high period of US lynching and also the period of imperial reconfiguration on a world scale. It's the period that normalized the nation state as a territorial distinction, as an aspirational form, and allegedly natural group expression. And with it, the attendant possibilities for self-determination, but also the perils of blood and soil exclusivity that resolve as the 20th century's prime political innovation, fascism. These changes express and provisionally fix, which is to say remedy and also reify, racial capitalism in the throes, also perpetual, of saving itself from itself. Even as sterner negations than reformist reform, which is to say revolutionary anti-capitalist social forms, including states, sought to heighten antagonisms to produce something non-reformist through changing what already is to what might, in an abolitionist sense, become. The end of Jim Crow, hard fought, was not, in my view, advanced by the depiction of people dying over and over and over again, or held still, as the photo caption says, taken from death, still life, still death, though Emmett Till's picture certainly moved a lot of people, death still. Rather, communism, in various forms including democratic centralism plus guns, explains more about how US racial capitalism's political system capitulated to ending Jim Crow, just as it explains the end of Portuguese, Belgian, French, British, and other colonial empires. It's foolish to think the images circulating today cannot become levers of power that make people who are sick and tired of being sick and tired, as Fannie Lou Hamer famously put it, become able to do. But to do what? And what about all the other eyes watching too? What do the images then or now do to consciousness? The problem with seeing the problem is a presumption then of what can be seen and whether a moving image, in the case of smartphone technology, made thanks to the global circulation of conflict materials, of land grabs and hunger and dispossession, will defeat the forces that make the machine potentially useful in the first place. I do not subscribe to the ordinary reading of Audre Lorde's The Master's Tools, because for me, the apostrophe in masters is the most important part of the sentence. To whom do the tools belong, and what can be done with them? The differentiated historical geography of the present suggests that consciousness is key to representability, which then requires an imaginative coherence based in something more fertile than either an assertive or ascriptive, and certainly not a demographic, identity. It's rather something I've called for a while the infrastructure of feeling, what underlies our productive ability to break the system by making something else, by seeing something else already in action. This is abolition, and it is presence. In the closing pages of Black Reconstruction in America, as all my students who are present tonight know, W.E.B. Du Bois discusses the propaganda of history. As you likely know, Du Bois based a good deal of that essential book in rereading the standard historical works on Reconstruction, though he certainly examined archives of the Freedmen's Bureau in his earlier historical and sociological examinations. Du Bois concludes they wrote so much because they saw so little. Abolition geography starts from the homely premise that freedom is a place. Placemaking is a normal human activity. We figure out how to combine people and land and other resources with our social capacity to organize ourselves in a variety of ways, whether to stay put or go wandering. Each of these factors, people, land, other resources, social capacity, comes in a number of types, all of which determine but do not define what can or should be done. Working outward and downward from this basic premise, abolitionist critique concerns itself with the greatest and least detail of these arrangements of people and resources and land over time. It shows how relationships of unfreedom consolidate and stretch, but not for the purpose of reciting misery. Rather, the point is not only to identify central contradictions, which is to say the inherent vices in regimes of dispossession, but also urgently to show how radical consciousness in action can actually resolve into liberated lifeways, however provisional, present, and past. Indeed, the radical tradition from which abolition geography draws meaning and method looks back in time-space, not in order to abolish history, but rather to see alternatives to the despairing sense that so much change in retrospect seems only ever to have been displacement and redistribution of human sacrifice. If unfinished liberation is the still to be achieved work of abolition, then at bottom what is to be abolished isn't the past or its present ghost, but rather the processes of hierarchy, dispossession, and exclusion that congeal in and as group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. W.B. Du Bois interviewed Harriet Tubman late in her life. She's my girl, that's a gun. For a while, in the mid-20th century, a small but raucous scholarly competition developed to prove how many, which is to say how few, people Tubman helped keep moving along the Underground Railroad. By contrast, Harvard and Humboldt-trained historian and sociologist Du Bois, a numbers guy if ever there was one, said hundreds. Then he said thousands. Why? Did he just get sloppy? Or did he begin to see how abolition geographies are made on the ground, everywhere along the route, the time route as well as the space route? Indeed, was he able to redo in Black Reconstruction what he did because of the insights that he gained from talking to Harriet Tubman. So now I'm going to, I lost a page, which is, yes, I did, okay. So now I'm going to shift here and first criticize myself. And that criticism has to do with this. It is really difficult not to recite the horrors. It is so hard not to enumerate the terrible, terrible things. And all of us in this room who are studying, who are working toward, who are trying to lift up social change, and who are studying and trying to obliterate oppression, and especially undo racial capitalism, which is to say all of capitalism, have a tendency to recite the horrors because perhaps we hope, perhaps we think that in that recitation we will find a crack, an opening, or more likely a crowd to do things with us, that they will be hailed by the image, hailed by the recitation. So as a result of thinking about the recitation, having recited many things myself, and wondering about why it is I find recitation both satisfying and ultimately too troubling to bear, I started to think about the drama of revolution and think about it with and through, of all people, Bertolt Brecht. So in thinking with Brecht, what I started to do, and I've been trying to write this for a couple of years now, I've been trying to talk about how the work of seeing is also the work of showing, not too quickly, the actions that matter. Action in the dramatic sense, the epic sense, expresses a desire no less than a complaint, a future as well as the past it's intended to reconfigure, and it does so, again in the epic theater, by exposing the fragility and the contradictions of the present. It has occurred to me, as I said in recent years, that we, and I mean all of we, read political writing in order to recite from it. We recite slogans, definitions, methods, facts, but we don't so much read to see how it works and to see what work can be done with it. By contrast, Any of us who were trained in the arts, in the lively arts, the dramatic arts, as I was, 2 of my 3 degrees are in drama, learn to read and to watch and to see and to encounter stage and film by figuring out certain patterns in the narrative structure and then either be excited by the pattern realizing itself or inspired that it doesn't. So to give you a perfectly simple example, we learned that if a woman dressed all in white goes in the elevator and the elevator doors close, she's not going to make it out alive. When the doors open again, she'll be lying in blood. And that's Angie Dickinson in one of the Hitchcock films. We learned many ways to anticipate the drama, and therefore, when a woman dressed all in white goes in the elevator and the elevator doors open and she comes out, we've got a new way of thinking about the world. So in thinking about how to see and to see what works, I'd like to suggest here that in revolution, the form of war is a rehearsal of change as well as a means to produce the opportunity for it. That in a revolution, the form of war is a rehearsal for change as well as a means to produce the opportunity for change. So now I'm going to tell you a story, and here I'm going to be really slick with my transition slide. I'm going to tell you a story about the PAIGC so you can see what I mean, and then we can talk. All right, so everybody knows that the PAIGC was the African Party for the Liberation of Guinea-Bissau and Cabo Verde. And it was formed very slowly and deliberately over time. The revolution took a lot of planning, i.e. people didn't just get a suitcase of guns one day and say, hey, let's start shooting. Now that has happened in some places. It did not happen in the PAIGC. The party prepared for revolution. Amilcar Cabral, the guy with his glasses up there, but he's seeing, was an agronomist. And agronomists, you know, are soil scientists. They work in helping agricultural economies, agrarian economies be more productive. And he was raised to be part of the colonial professional managerial class, just as I was educated to be part of the professional managerial class of the United States. I mean, they sent me to school so I would control all of you, not share with you what I'm talking about tonight. So Cabral and other students from the Portugal's colonies, or what Portugal called at the time the overseas provinces, were in school attending classes, graduate classes in Lisbon in the late 50s and early 1960s. And because of the apartheid eugenics dyad that was in fact pretty much everywhere in the overdeveloped and intermediate developed world, the students from the overseas provinces were not allowed to live in the housing with the students from continental Portugal. So they all lived together. Well, that was a recipe for disaster, wasn't it? They lived around the corner from where I live in Lisbon today. So they got to know each other, they plotted, they planned, they learned, they studied, they slipped out of Lisbon, ran away, and converged in Paris with other revolutionary cadres from around the world. Part of the preparation was not only to secure the weapons and the military training to be able to wage a successful hot war against their colonial oppressors, they also designed schools. So this is the preparing for hot war. And this, told you, Sonia, this is a book that is about to come out in a few weeks, written by somebody who's sitting in the third row here. You sent it to me, honey. That's about the liberation schools that the PAIGC developed, planned before going back to Guinea-Bissau to start shooting. They planned an entire curriculum. This is all in this book, Sonia Vashborg. They planned an entire curriculum. They wrote books. The books were printed in Sweden by some communists who had access to a printing press in odd colors because they had to use the ink that was available. They trained soldiers to also be teachers. All of this is in this book by Sonia, coming from Peter Lang. And you can talk to her afterward. Row 3, right in the middle. Okay. And then during the Hot War, what happened was, as the zone was liberated, some of the soldiers who were also teachers would stay behind, and they and people from the community would build the school. So they also had a plan of, well, in this area we can build a school with these materials because that's what's there, and in another area we'll be able to build a school with different materials because that's what's there. Sonia also made a film, it's a really beautiful short film about the schools. So they did all of that. They also had cadres prepared to produce the history of that present, to produce the history of that present. So this person, who will be in New York, April 9th, showing a film at Anthology Film Archive, and then April 12th and 13th at a fantastic conference at the Graduate Center in the People's Forum, was, his name is Sana Nhada. And Sana, when he was 13 years old, 1963, heard there was a revolution going on and ran away to join up. And he showed up and said, "Shoot, give me a gun, teach me to shoot." And the cadre he encountered said, "What do you know how to do?" And he said, "What do you mean? What can you do?" And he said, "I can read. Some Franciscans came through my village, and they taught a few of us boys how to read." At the time, literacy in Guinea-Bissau was maybe 3 or 4%, perhaps 5. Very, very low rates of literacy. So Sana was told, "You're not shooting anybody. What you're going to do is teach soldiers how to read when they come back on furlough. That's your job, to teach people how to read." So Sana, at age 13, became a teacher, and when he wasn't teaching people how to read, so teaching adult literacy basically, he would help the medical team with injured people. Eventually, he became 18 and thought, well, now I can have a gun and I can go shoot somebody. And he was told, no, actually, we are really impressed by what a good storyteller you are. So you and 3 of your comrades are going to Havana, Cuba, where you're going to learn how to become filmmakers. Off they went. So Sana and 3 other people went to Cuba, where they encountered cadres from around the world, from ongoing revolutions around the world, who all gathered there in Cuba. So Cuba doesn't just only export doctors, it also trained filmmakers and so on and so forth. That little island has had a huge effect on this planet. They learned to make films, and in the film spell reel that those of you in the seminar have seen, we see some of the footage that the cadre shot. But here is what I find the most intriguing, and what confirms me in thinking there's something about this rehearsal for the future that might be developable as a thought. They filmed footage they couldn't see immediately. There was absolutely no capacity to develop the film that they exposed in their cameras when they were shooting scenes from the actual war, from the conflict, grenade launchers and people fighting, and also Cabral giving lectures, and also people in school and so forth. They couldn't see it, but they made it anyway. They made it anyway. They were using their eyes to be able to see not just the problem, but its various kinds of solutions. In other words, it made the problem of seeing different, but also a centrally motivating force in the work of rehearsal. So today, so in 2019, the circulation of the footage and discussion of what is and isn't invisible in contemporary Guinea-Bissau, including the post-colonial, if not decolonial history of the present, is a use to which that footage is put. And I will say that the filmmaker whose name spell reel carries, Philippa Cesar, did a really amazing thing, which is she had been traveling to Guinea-Bissau working. She's an artist, has lived most of her adult life in Berlin. She's Portuguese, but she'd been traveling to Guinea-Bissau. She found out that this footage, which had been in canisters all this time in a very damp climate, appropriate for perhaps chocolate cultivation, but not for film preservation, was in danger of being completely lost. So she ran around, because this is how Philippa Cesar is, she ran around and talked to everyone who had money to see if they would pay to restore, to save this footage, this undeveloped footage in these cans. And fortunately for the footage, it took her a while to find the right combination of talent and money. And in that interim, some people I think it was in Berlin, correct me if I'm wrong, Sonia, some people in Berlin developed a technique that would save way more of the footage than any previously existing technique could do. So about 40 of 100 hours were partially or completely saved. So some of that footage is in this film Spell Reel that's also about the making of that cadre, the making of the revolution, and also the conditions of Guinea-Bissau today. And we see, for example, in the film, Sana and other people going with the film to village squares in Guinea-Bissau and having discussions in the open air after showing Spell Reel about what the history of Guinea-Bissau has been from the time of the revolution until now. I told you at the beginning of the talk that one of the two projects that I participated in was the one called Maximum Security University, in which we used the footage of a number of prisoners in the California Security Housing Unit being shot dead like fish in a barrel by prison guards. And I also told you that the film, the instructive, the admissible and illegal setting film that we made from that footage did not persuade anybody of anything that changed materially either the fact of that security housing unit existing, prison within a prison, or the ways in which guards like street police have such high levels of impunity when it comes to taking people's lives. But Harun Farokhi, the late, great filmmaker, also made a film using that footage, the footage from the security camera unit in the security housing unit. But instead of making a didactic narrative that quite straightforwardly shows that what the guards said happened couldn't have happened, because look at the date and time, he instead took that footage with the voiceover that we had produced and put it together with other kinds of surveillance materials, including the kind of, at that time, which is about 20 years ago, the kind of electronic surveillance and control that is used in grocery stores to track how people make their way through aisles and the extent to which they pause at one shelf or another in order to give retailers insights about what to put where to put the chocolate bar. He put those things together, and the title of that film of Farokhi's is I Thought I Was Seeing Convicts. And showing this highly pixelated black and white going back and forth between the retail, the surveillance of people in the visiting room, and the surveillance of the people being destroyed, their lives taken by unseen guards, gives us a bit of an insight into the kind of surveillance society we live in today. And that is all I'm going to say about surveillance. But I am going to say something more about Farokhi, and then I'm done. As you probably know, Farokhi also made a film in which he used this painting to talk about Potosi, what happened there in that incredible mine, in present-day Bolivia, and how this painting, there was a depiction of the town and the mountain and the mine, painted long after the mine was the productive place it was, which is already a curiosity. This massive painting became what Farocki used to try to see how this painter saw the problem in order to shake our consciousness and show us a different way of thinking about the world. So his film, The Silver and the Cross, has many, many scenes, many of you have probably seen it, many scenes in which this massive, massive painting is examined at a very magnified and tiny detail. So we can see the depiction of people going to work and coming home. But we also see that sorting and stacking machinery of this era, we see that certain kinds of people get more brush strokes in this massive painting than other kinds of people. So there's only like the suggestion and then the actual realization of representation. So Farocki taught me, as Du Bois and Tubman and others taught me, to think about seeing differently from how I had been seeing. And to end us, and to open up for conversation, I want to go to another artist's picture. Well, that's not a bad representation of it. So this is Trevor Paglen's work. And this photograph, which I use with his permission and blessing, is called Invisible. So Trevor did a project many years ago. In fact, it was his dissertation project. I was his teacher once upon a time, trying to figure out how to use the tools of photography, like this amazing camera down here shooting my nose, and the tools of geography, the theoretical tools of geography, to represent the existence of the various quote-unquote black sites, which is to say hidden, officially unnamed sites of the US military in the continental United States and beyond. So this is one of his remarkable pictures of a place that officially doesn't exist in the United States. It doesn't matter what its name is. The name of the picture is Invisible. And what I think I see when I look at Invisible is, instead of an image that gives me a sense that there is no hope against the military might of racial capitalism as it goes through its various and sequential eruptions and saving itself from itself, I think perhaps what I see instead in Trevor's picture, and certainly what I learned to see by looking at Sananada's work and thinking about his work and thinking about Sonia Vash-Borges's work and the other work that I've shared with you this evening, is that maybe this is a picture of the contradiction of the military-industrial complex rather than a picture of the thing, which is to say, perhaps this is a picture of us coming to meet ourselves, I would prefer, in the near future. Thank you.